Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Is everyone there? Yes.
Yes, we're here. Welcome to us in Stockholm.
Hello, Stockholm. I feel like the Eurovision Song Contest. England, 12 points.
The floor is yours.
Okay.
I was just curious because we forgot to ask you. Your masters. You're going.
Yes, I'm going to start this summer. So I'm moving to America in August. Yeah, I'm going to be studying public policy at Harvard, so I'm quite excited.
Whoa.
I've started doing some economics reading because I'm a history graduate, so it's all quite new for me.
Exciting.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good place to start. Just a little bit of an introduction to who I am. So I'm still relatively young. I've been a campaigner for 3 years. And in that time, I've worked for Avaaz.org and 38 Degrees, which is another kind of online campaigning organization here in the UK. So some larger organizations like Oxfam. And I hope Barbara is in the room somewhere, because I went to the Arctic with WWF in 2008. And that really kind of woke up my passion for climate change. And I set up the Youth Climate Coalition in the UK with a friend. And we really got engaged in the run-up to Poznan and Copenhagen, these big UN processes around climate change. And that was the first experience of seeing a system which didn't really achieve what it was set out to achieve. And now seeing that with the economy as well. And I'm afraid within the NGO sector, I got very frustrated as well about organizations that didn't really respond to the needs of their members, that didn't really seem to be able to collaborate together, and saw all sorts of issues within the NGO sector. So when I read Common Cause, I felt like, oh, this is great. Yes, this feels right to me. And so I was lucky enough to find myself now starting to work on looking at what does all of this theory look like in practice for NGOs that do campaigning. So I said to Pella as well, I can talk a lot about campaigning, I can talk a lot about NGOs, but the theory is, as a history graduate, it's new to me as well. So I can happily give you an overview, but if you have detailed questions about research or about different studies, I'm not the right person to ask. But hopefully we're in the same conversation and we'll be talking about practice more than theory. But just to give you a little bit of an overview of the research, and particularly what that means within the NGO context, values are something that we all share. So we look at this circumplex, you may have seen the circle with all the different values, and it's very easy to fall into the trap of saying, oh, I'm a person who cares, about other people or the natural world, like I'm a good person, and there are other people who are the bad people. This is totally not true. We all share all of these values. So it's really important to remember that, in the morning I can be compassionate and kind, and in the afternoon I can be a real douchebag. I can be really dismissive of someone else, or I can behave very differently. So we all share all of these values, and our values shift within a day, within a month, within a year, depending on who we're with, our background, our life experience, what institutions we're engaging with. So, for example, I could be, if I'm in a room sitting in a circle and we're talking about what we care about, it can feel like a very equal conversation, and because the room is set up, there's no one at the head of the table, we're all equal. And then I might walk into an office where there is someone who is very senior to me, and the relationship changes, and I have a different set of values that are activated because I'm in that different situation. So these values, they are in flux, they're always moving. So for us as NGOs, we then have to think about, well, how are we engaging with these moving values, and how are we contributing to pushing them in one direction or another? And this is really the thing that made me interested in this work, because a lot of NGOs in the UK will use messages like, in an environmental context, buy this, light bulb, it will save you money and it's better for the planet, for example. Or turn off your lights when you leave the room, it'll save you money and it's better for the planet. So the primary reason to switch off your light bulb is to save you money, according to this communication. And that's problematic because that's actually stimulating and strengthening the values of material wealth, of looking at, me first and others second, which is a lot of what we're trying to counter in terms of sustainable behavior change, where we are realizing that we have to consider other people, where we have to consider the natural world. So often the very actors, NGOs, who we want to be promoting a sustainable message will actually be undermining that by using values which kind of go against that behavior. So that's kind of the, in a really 1 minute version, the theory in terms of what it means for us as NGOs. And I just wanted to share in the next kind of 20 minutes the work I've been doing and some of the themes that I've been seeing within that work. And I will be writing all of this down over the next 2 months, and we'll be publishing it in August. So feel free to take notes or not take notes. You'll have it written down in a couple of months. So the work I'm doing really comes into 3 parts. The first one is very simple, which is collecting case studies of where I think we're already seeing this values approach in action. So it is going to look at organizations big and small who are consciously or unconsciously already applying this values approach. And really those case studies are there, and you can see them on the internet, and there's more to come. The case studies are there to try and challenge and to inspire campaigners to see that things can be done differently. Because often it can be very, it can seem like an insurmountable challenge. Things are so tricky to shift. So those are really there as stories of inspiration. The second thing I've been doing is trying to build a community of interest. So I've been engaging in conversations, hosting events, running all sorts of different events for campaigners who are interested in these questions to come together, to meet, to build relationships, and to really legitimize this conversation. Because it's often, it has an implicit criticism of the status quo. So it's therefore sometimes a little uncomfortable to open this conversation. So building that community has been a really important part of my work. And the final thing that I've been doing, which was very new to me, is running an action learning process. So working with the same group of 17 campaigners from 9 different NGOs over a timeline of 6 months, running workshops with them every month, and they have to have, it's like school. They have homework. They come back at the end of the month and write up a report of how their homework has gone and all of this kind of thing. And so a lot of this, the data and the intelligence that I'm going to share with you today, comes from those 3 things: from the case studies, the community, and from the action learning process. So to kind of give you some themes of what does common cause look like in practice for campaigners. For me, the first one, which is, and again, I say specifically it's for campaigners, I think there's some useful information here for people who do communication work or who are, lobbying politicians. But what I'll share is quite focused on campaigning specifically. So I think the first thing that common cause in practice looks like is a much stronger emphasis on relationships. And in many ways, this is very obvious. When, if you ask the general public, who do you trust? They may say, journalists near the bottom, politicians near the bottom, up a little higher, maybe a doctor, maybe higher a judge, but at the very top, friends and family. So if we hear a recommendation from a friend or family member, we trust it much, much more because they're similar to us. We trust them, we know them. And every kind of big corporate brand knows this. So that's why they're always trying to get, people to advocate their brands to their friends and family. So this shouldn't be a surprise. And the second thing, which we shouldn't be surprised about, is that if we think about how we first got involved with social change work or environmental work, it was often through a relationship. So maybe someone gave us a book, or someone took us along to a meeting. You know, it's very relationships driven. But when, as an NGO, we're thinking about building our campaign, building our membership base, we very rarely think about how we build on the existing relationships that are already there. So I want to give some examples of how some kind of relationship-focused campaigns are already using this approach. And one of my favorite ones is a collaboration between Oxfam, which is an international development charity, and the Women's Institute, which is a traditionally very conservative organization, which has kind of 7,000 chapters around the United Kingdom, mostly rural women's groups. And partnership with the Women's Institute to get them to take action on international development. So they just kind of gave a usual kit for activists to these local groups and said, okay, go for it. Well, that didn't really work so well, because this was a very different profile of people. So they started to think, well, what do these women do when they get together on a weekly basis? What they do is they have conversations, they chat to each other. These are friends who meet every week or every month. So they started to design actions around that principle of the relationships within the group. And what they developed was something very, very simple to try and shift the expectations and understandings of why does poverty exist. And they had something called the Women Reaching Women program, which was essentially about helping these women talk about poverty. So there were some really uncomfortable kind of attitudes that they encountered. So, you know, attitudes like, well, they don't work, you know, people in Africa don't work very hard, or you know, a very condescending approach of, well, should just send them some money and things will get better, which Oxfam know is not the case. But so they really built on these existing relationships. I can give some more examples, but I will keep moving. The second thing, which I think Common Cause in practice looks like for campaigners, is to focus much more on giving people experiences rather than information. So and this is really all about the self-direction value. So often as a campaigner, I'm trying to convince people of what I think. So I'm giving them information, statistics, or I might be trying to, you know, tug on their emotions by showing them a sad picture or a really, you know, a devastating end. But actually what's more powerful, even more powerful, is our own direct experience. So how can we help people understand something for themselves? Because if we accept that we all share these different values, that means we're all capable of coming to shared understandings of the world. So, for example, again, I'll use the Women's Institute because they're a great example. One member whose son was in prison, and he had severe mental health difficulties, and he committed suicide. So they started a campaign to try and force the government to provide better mental health provision within prisons. Well, for the Women's Institute, this is a very unlikely campaign. And the staff knew that it would have a very low pickup on the membership because people don't really understand mental health very well. Most of these women didn't have any experience with the prison system. So instead of asking them to, you know, write a letter to your member of parliament or to write a letter to the newspaper or take some political action, they thought, how can we give these women an experience so that they understand the issue? So that the campaign asked was to take public transport and visit a prisoner in prison. That was it. And so all these kind of ladies from the countryside got on buses to go and visit a prisoner. And they realized a couple of things. First of all, it's actually very difficult to take public transport to a prison. You know, the buses are irregular, for example, or there are no buses to the prison. The second thing is, it's a very humiliating experience. You know, you're patted down by the guards, you're waiting in the waiting room. And then thirdly, meeting an actual prisoner was totally, you know, against a lot of the stereotypes which these women have. So, and going through that process, when they came home, they were outraged. They were totally angry and they send 10 letters to their member of parliament or 10 letters to the news. Giving them that experience helped them to understand the issue for themselves and really embodied that value of self-direction, which we know is so important. So relationships and experiences. I think the third one, and this is really obvious, so forgive me, but we are beings, what makes us human is our ability to tell stories. And we are much better at remembering information if it's within a narrative structure, if it's within a story. And when I worked at Avaaz and 38 Degrees, every email that we send has to have what we call reader-focused theory of change. So every email has to include a very clear reason why this person who receives this email is part of this campaign. Why is this person essential in this part of the story? You may see lots of newsletters like I do, which start with, at the Brundtland Institute, we've had a busy month. And, I my email inbox, and the first thing I think is, I don't care. How is this relevant to me? So we have to be very, very specific about creating a story in which the member of the public is central. How are they part of this story? And there's all sorts of different tools that you can use. The hero's journey is a very famous one, which you see in kind of great myths and religious stories. Public one of kind of telling your own story. And this also has something to do with, as an organization, what's the organizational story? What is it? So I won't be too controversial, but WWF in the UK has gone through a strategy renewal. And it doesn't have a strategy. It's pretty difficult. It doesn't have a story. There isn't a clear story for the organization. It's really important to have a story for how the person you're talking to fits into the campaign, and also what the organizational story is. Because within stories help us share the values that we hold. So I can illustrate the values that I hold by telling you a story about who I am. And that's much, it's so much better doing that than, as you often hear politicians, that I believe in freedom and I believe in whatever different value, when really it's much better to articulate that through a story. So that's the third one. I'll just have a drink of water as I keep talking. Another theme that I've really is really bad at measuring things. We have a lot of monitoring and evaluation that we have to do for our reports and all of these things, but data on how many volunteers, how much money have we raised, signatures did we collect, any data for things like how much trust is there in our coalition, how much innovation is happening at the grassroots, what are the strength of the relationships between the head office and the grassroots. And all of these things are incredibly important if we want to win our campaigns. I think if you've mission as I have, you know how important that is, because so often it goes wrong. And so in the action learning process that I've been running, I'm trying to measure different things. And it sounds silly, but I'm measuring things like, do people bring biscuits or cake to meetings to share? Do people cry in a meeting? Silly, but really powerful indicators that say, do people themselves here? Do they feel comfortable to be vulnerable? Do they make friends? Do they care people who they're working with? Because we know that in this process of kind of the great transition through environmental and economic change, it's incredibly important that we look after each other. So these are really powerful pieces of data which give us indications of the health of our organization and of our social movements. But we just need to measure different things. So I'm trying to be creative with that and very open to new ideas. And there's also, there's mounting evidence for this. There's an organization here in the UK, Waste Watch. It's a pretty, the mission is pretty dull. They're there to, get people to recycle more. And for many years, they've existed by local government giving them money for a 2 or 3 year project, work in a specific area, a specific geographic location for that time, and then they leave. And the amount of recycling kind of goes up and then goes down again. So pretty short-term impact. But they want to use this approach. And instead of going to these people, hey, you should recycle more. How can we help you recycle? People, what do you like about this area? What do you not like about this area? What would you like to see changed? And are you willing to work with other people here to try and change things for the better? Well, people are pretty open to that. And they just started organizing spaces for a community to come together. So with food, with music, with dancing, they're doing workshops with teenagers around like pop music, lyrics, anything to get these people together and to talk about the place in which they live. And what they're finding is, once these people start talking together about what matters to them, what they care about, they'll start suggesting things that they can change. And within that is recycle more. So instead of coming to the action, they're starting with the shared values and then building towards the action. And they just released a little report to send to you, which is really instructive. But throughout that process, they've been measuring things like, are people talking to each other more? Are they using facilities more? Because all of these things indicate the health of the community and will be related to the recycling rates as well. So that's another theme. One other theme which I think is really interesting and is difficult for us as NGOs is we often have an organizational strategy, which is great, but we seem to think that the people who we deal with, our members, our supporters, live in silos. They are little islands. When in practice, we know that if my mother, for example, she's a member of one organization, the National Trust, but she's also a member of Friends of the Earth, and she's involved in a local transition camp, and 2 or 3 other local things. So the people who are our supporters are very likely to be involved with 2, 3, 4, or 5 other organizations. But we seem to think, we will just create our supporter journey for this one person within our one organization. So I think that if we're going to work with common cause, we have to have a movement strategy as well as an organizational strategy. And that's to collaborate. If we understand how each of us fit into a different part of the puzzle, and it doesn't mean we have to agree all the time, it just means that we understand where we fit in. And common cause, the reason why it's called common cause is because we think that a lot of the NGOs who are working on different issues, whether it's maternal health in Africa, or gay rights in England, animal welfare, or prison rights, actually the values that sit underneath those organizations are very shared. So that's why it's really important that we're in discussion with one another and that hindering one another. So, and that's why I think this idea of like a movement strategy is really, really important for us to have some shared dialogue around. Because the values that we're all working with don't just impact our own organization, they impact everything. So that's another one. I think number 6 is, it's really UK specific, so forgive me if this isn't accurate for Sweden, but there's a real importance to have rigor in learning, I think. So that's both doing research into, the latest social psychology, as my colleague Tom has done, who you've spoken before, but it's also about really investing in the training for people who start as campaigners or who start their journey within the NGO sector. There are so many people employed within the UK NGO sector who have never had a formal, strategy training or a formal audience analysis or a power map. So these often they will finish university and do an internship and then get a job and suddenly be making decisions about public engagement for which they've actually never really had the training. So I think there has to be a real rigor in learning if we're going to take this work seriously. And that means being really, rigorous about what we're trying to do and where we're getting our information from. And my final thing, just to share with you, one that I found particularly. So, I'm really could do, but it's very uncomfortable when you start with values because you start looking at your own values. So I think what I've really learned is that in order to create change externally, we have to be willing to create change internally. And this is nothing new, of course, but if we're serious about our values work, it starts with ourselves. So if we want to change the values of our organization or of our society, we have to start by trying to strengthen our better self, our intrinsic self. And so this is on an individual level, but also on an organizational level. So for example, stories around organizations in the UK who are trying to apply this value approach in their own structures. So one small sustainable development organization that works with young people with 9 staff, so very small, has just shifted from a kind of a seed program manager model to a flat hierarchy, of which there are a couple of others here in the UK. Or UK have had a big about diversity and about inclusion, race, gender, and which is always the big one in the UK. Because if we're going to talk about this, we have to. So I think this is really where it's been fascinating for me to look at organizations that have a religious base. So, for example, within the action learning process that I'm doing, there's 2 people from team.He Fund, which is an evangelical Christian development organization. You know, and as a gay man, that was already a little bit frightening. But actually, talking to them about values and talking to them about embodying that, it was fascinating to say, you know, Casper, we've been trying to talk about values for 2,000 years. and or, you know, people who are religious or people who are, you know, spiritual, a lot of things like prayer or meditation or times of reflection and silence are really times when they try and tap into their best self, where they try and live their values, try to recommit to that. And I think it's really interesting within a secular organization to think about how can we create space for reflection where we can recommit to our intrinsic values, because it's so easy to get caught up in the, you know, deadlines and business plans and everything else that we have to do. But it has to start with us if we're to embody it elsewhere. So this was a little kind of tour de force of the different themes that I'm seeing in terms of how organizations can apply Common Cause. I'd love to hear any questions that you have or any clarifications, but I'll probably stop there and hand over to Pella.
Wow, thank you. And maybe you want to see us again. I took us away because the sound wasn't very good at all times. And I'm sad to inform you that Barbara isn't here. Oh. But you should be glad, because then of course she should have stepped forward and gave you a virtual hug. Okay, so I open the floor. Questions to Casper, and please, I think maybe you just step forward here or pass it through me. Anybody?
I have one. Hi, Casper. I have a simple and difficult question. What is your vision? It's truly an important question. Where are we heading? Sort of.
Yeah, this is a very cool question. So I will answer that within the Common Cause frame rather than me personally. Is that cool?
Yeah, feel free.
So it's great, and I'm going to copy you to an amazing model called the 2 loops model for system change. Which there's a great little 6-minute video which I'll send to Pella to show you, and for me it really helps understand where I think I want to be going with all of this, and also importantly how to get there. So if my vision is really a sustainable, just world where we on a daily basis try and embody these values of our best selves. And what I find so hopeful within that story is that everyone is capable of great kindness and of great compassion. And what I'm interested in is how do we create the institutions and the relationship between the individual and the state and the individual and business, where these intrinsic values are constantly strengthened. Because in many ways, we're in a kind of like values battle on a daily basis. For example, advertising is a really strong primer towards extrinsic values. It's constantly saying, you know, you're not beautiful enough, or you're not cool enough, or you should buy this to be happy, or whatever else the adverts underneath the message say, what they tell us. And they're constantly appealing to us in our smallest self that we're not enough. So that's why we've done a little bit of work on the advertising industry to think about actually, you know, no NGO has been set up to try and combat the advertising industry, and yet it has enormous effects on the image of women in public media, on the sexualization of children, on consumerist behavior, which is unsustainable. But none of those organizations who work on those issues would see advertising as their kind of campaign space. So we've been trying to find these common causes which different allies, different organizations can get behind. So I think my vision for Common Cause is really to be a kind of an alarm bell towards NGOs who are kind of carrying on the usual track, to think much more long-term and much more broadly about how does social change actually happen. And the frightening thing is, and you'll have heard this in the last talk, where Tom would have given you a couple of examples around framing in the US.
Oh no.
Aside, I can be so blunt, are very aware of this. So they will always be funding things that change the conversation, not just what changes the policy. So my vision is that the Common Cause agenda really shifts how NGOs start to work together, how they interact with their membership. This is a really big one for me. The kind of the central frame of how NGOs work in the UK is that they see their membership as supporters who give us money, who give us an email address, who give us, you know, their signature on a petition, and then we, professional social change makers, will go and deliver that social change for them, like we're providing a service for this membership. And I think that is a really small way of thinking about what work that we do. For me, the reframe that I want to see, the vision, how I think civil society can work, is that we, as professional, you know, NGOs, are supporters of wider movements. So it's our responsibility to share the information, to share the strategy, to share the understanding, to share the resources, to share the skills that is necessary for individuals to put into practice the change that they want to see. And that's all about self-direction, that's all about benevolence and universalism. Because right now it's a very kind of reductionist model for social change, which isn't having an impact in the long term. And for example, you know, many people within climate change world say, fantastic, Britain, first country to have a national climate change act. You know, we have a law to take action on climate change. We're now in the middle of a process with a new law, which is basically going to strip all of that away. And it's because the NGOs here have not invested in truly building movements to protect those kind of steps forward in our national legislation. As strong as the public support for them. And what's more important to the general public is the price of their heating bills or the price of their electricity. Because we haven't invested the energy and the resource into building that kind of popular support, which only happens with this different approach. So my Common Cause can kind of be the alarm bell that shifts NGO practice. I hope that's good enough.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, Dominique,
Thank you.
you're welcome. And how many questions do we have? Are you the only one? Yeah, okay. So, okay, so we have 5 more questions. So please be...
I'll be short, sorry.
Yeah.
Very excited.
You're welcome. Jaha, du menar så. Det kan det vara. Det kommer du med nu.
No, I can see you.
Ja.
Thanks a lot, Casper, for sharing. Basically, I'm working with an initiative called World Values Day. So I wanted to ask a question regarding, basically what we are trying to do is create this space for people to reflect during one day around their basically personal values and how to create that change. And so I wanted to come back to this where you talked about storytelling, and just your comment on when you're going into a storytelling exercise, whether you want sort of to create the whole picture first, and or rather go directly on, let's say, self-transcendence and openness to change values. I mean, I think there are pros and cons to both approaches, basically. So, yeah.
Cool. I mean, that sounds like a great initiative. And to demonstrate my point, let me do two things. The first thing is to say, I care about social justice and equality and freedom. So those are the values that I care about. And number two, I'll tell you a story which illustrates that. So when I was 13, I was very young, in England, I was at boarding school. And so I shared a room with 3 other boys who had kind of rock musician posters on the wall and, you know, half-naked lady posters on the wall. And there was me, 13-year-old, trying to, you know, figure out, oh my goodness, I like boys and not girls. This is terrifying. And I felt very afraid, and I felt very alone and scared and all the other normal things that you feel at that age in that situation. And so that experience for me is so important, which has really led me to do the work that I'm doing today, because I understand what it's like to be marginalized. So what I've just tried to do there is to illustrate, like, you understand now why I care about social justice in a way that would never have worked if I just said to you, I care about social justice. So I think it's really cool that you're asking people to think about what's important to them, but I'd really encourage you to think about, you know, what are the like, maybe ask people, what are the moments in your life that have shaped who you are today? Or, you know, what's your favorite place in the world? Or try questions which will really bring stories out, and not just simple words that say, you know, that mean something, but actually are very shallow. And it's also much more fun to think about the stories that have shaped you. So, but it sounds like a great initiative. Do let us know, and we can publicize it as well.
Thank you.
Okay, just step forward and please talk so that both Casper and all of us can hear, like you've done.
Hi. Here I am. Thanks for the presentation. I work a lot with climate policy lobbying, trying to change legislation and stuff, which often means aiming for short-term goals, like a new legislation, increased ambitions and stuff, which means that you often fall in the trap of talking about, oh, this saves you money and this is good for the economy and everything, and then working on the wrong set of values. But at the same time, I don't feel I can afford working on these long-term values, and which would mean I wouldn't see anything happening in like today's policies. Could you elaborate on that kind of conflict? Because I'm sure you've heard this question before.
I feel your pain. Like, so there are a couple of different answers to this question, and I'll start with the hopeful question, the hopeful answer, which is, so there's a really great program in Scotland called the Natural Change Program, and this was set up by WWF, and they've been trying to lobby politicians in Scotland and business leaders and journalists to try and take stronger action on climate change, and it just really wasn't happening. There wasn't a real energy around it. So what they decided to do, they thought, rather than try and explain, you know, climate change and it's all dreadful and we're all going to hell in a handbasket, they thought, okay, how can we give people an experience so that these decision makers, these people with power, will understand this issue for themselves? So what they did over, I think, a year-long process, they would take them to places of natural beauty in a group of about 10 or 12 people, and they would just explain how the ecosystem works. You know, how this tree relates to this bird, which relates to this moss, and it would really awaken these people's natural wonder at the natural world. And because of the relationships which they formed within this group, and because of the relationship that they built in the natural world, these people suddenly became enormous advocates for protecting the natural world and therefore taking action on climate change. So that's a very high-end investment into certain decision makers. But it's an example, I think, of how we can bring the human being out of the job title. So often the people we're trying to lobby, it's just like, I am the Minister of the Economy, or I am the Minister of the Environment. If we can try and have a relationship with that person which goes beyond that, that's often really helpful. So that's kind of the first potential option. The second one is the kind of the warning story which I just shared about, you know what, you can pass as many laws as you like within the frame of it's going to be safer for our energy security, it's going to be better for our economy. But if the interests of the economy and the environment are no longer together, we've only strengthened the economy argument, not the environment argument. And that's what's happening in the UK right now. And the same thing in the sense that the Climate Change Act in the UK passed under a left-of-centre Labour administration. We now have a Conservative Liberal administration where none of those people are there. It's a completely different framework, and with every electoral system, you'll have parties in power at different times. So to hope that our arguments that work with one government will stay with the next one is risky. And then the final thing, which I think is perhaps the most challenging for us as NGOs, which is, for example, with this, you hear the same question with media. I'm trying to get a story about climate change into the press. The only thing that really gets response is shock stories. So, big impact of climate change, or, dire warnings from scientists. I only get those bad news stories in there. I never get solutions. But in Britain, there are 4,000 professional journalists, and there are 60,000 press officers. So it's way more geared towards this kind of machine of getting our information into the press. If you look at email lists, which already exist, some of them are 10 times bigger than the readership of an average newspaper. So there are all sorts of kind of new ways of communicating. Social media is obviously the big one. New ways of communicating to the general public. And so what I'm really, and this goes back to this vision question, I'm really interested in how can we start the implementation of solutions alongside the question of getting national governments to commit to certain carbon reduction targets. Because in actual fact, leadership is not going to come from the center. It's going to come from the periphery. And so my biggest interest, this is why I no longer work on trying to lobby our government on climate change, because I just don't see how we can reach the level of target of reduction targets within the current system that we have economically and environmentally. So my challenge to you is a little bit of thinking, well, if you think it's possible, then great. But if you don't think it's possible to avert dangerous climate change within this model, then we have to start thinking about the root causes of these problems and how do we shift that power. So more of a question to you than an answer. I'm really sorry.
Thank you. Ville?
Hi, I'm Margareta, and I participated in a seminar about common cause. I have read most part of the handbook or the other paper, and I've met a lot of people who are interested in environmental issues, but it's so difficult for me to keep their interest when I start to talk about this. I don't know, do you have any punchlines or things? Because it's really hard to communicate.
It is, and my tip to you is don't mention the word values. Don't tell them the science. I started off doing that as well, and people just kind of... And for me, actually, and this has been a real discussion within our team, because, Tom and Rich and the people who work with the science are so excited by it, and they have a scientific mind, and it makes sense to them. For me, I was like, oh, okay, this gives me some data I can work with, but really how I talk about it is I often talk about, for campaigners, I talk about how do we make our campaigns more effective. So trying to think about what are these people that I'm talking to interested in, Because often, and this is the big secret, within the NGO world, we know that we're not winning. Like, we know that we're missing something. And I think what I feel that a lot of my work is giving permission to people to say that they don't know and that they're stuck. And this is a really great way of saying, well, here is something maybe we can work with. So I guess the best thing is often talking about how you found this interesting for yourself and what it's meant for your work and what questions you're asking. Because often people will say, yes, me too, I have that, So that's often much easier. And then once you have that interest, you can say, oh, you should read the handbook. But I would really start about talking about your own experience and talking about the questions that you have. Because often that's what will really connect with people.
Thanks.
Thanks, Eliza.
Stig och Peter. Okej. Ja.
Well, hi Casper, Stig here. In a way you have answered my question, but I'd like to put it in this context of the three sectors in society. We have the civil society, we have the state power, we have the business. And how do you strengthen the civil society to negotiate, to cooperate maybe with the power sector, with the business sector? Maybe you could comment on that. You have done it already, but maybe...
That's a great question, and that's really the reason why I'm going back to university, because that's what I want to find out. But the things I've been thinking, and both my parents are entrepreneurs, so I come from people. What I'm really interested in, and I think the way in which civil society will build more power, is that we become more relevant to people's lives. In so many ways, a lot of NGOs here in the UK, at least, have very weak relationships with their supporters. They get a newsletter every month, but there's no power there. And from the kind of community organizing tradition, power is the ability to leverage relationships. That's what gives us power, people power, right? That's what it is. But to build that, we have to have meaningful relationships and some sort of commitment. And I think the way we do that is by baking cakes for each other again, by calling each other up if someone is sick, by forming community. And for someone of my generation, that's a very alien concept. Like, what is this community thing that you talk about? We're so mobile and it's all online and all these things. But what I'm really interested in is like, how do we build meaning back into people's lives, which so many people are currently lacking, and which therefore we try and find, whether it's in buying things or whether it's in TV, where we get great stories for free, all of that kind of stuff. So I'm really interested in trying to be relevant in people's lives and give them something which they actually need. So I think that's something that NGOs could really improve on, and that's what would build their power. So if you look at, there's a great organisation in the UK, which I think is a really good model for this, called Citizens UK. And what they've really done is work with communities to help them fix their problems. So it might be, I live in North London, which is the stabbing capital of London, the road which I live on. And so what they started doing is just asking shopkeepers to sign up to a scheme where someone is in danger, they will let the person in and close the door. Very simple. But that was the first way in engaging the community in a conversation about violence on the street, in a way that, police efforts, it was way too political. So I think if we can find ways to be meaningful, useful to people, that will really help build our civil society power.
Thank you. Last question.
Hi, I'm Peter. Hi. I was really fascinated when you talk about the multiplicity of our egos, that we have so many directions we can go into. I was in US and I met this Blueberry Pie Action Network against Keystone, which was a really good example where they were talking about that after the Al Gore film, less people, when you ask the question, believe in climate change. So the information has gone against. But when you ask the same people, there is this happening, what can you contribute to do that will make it much better. The same people that say that it doesn't exist will give a lot of the answers on what they can actually do, even conservative Republicans. So I think that was really a key, and how can we then address that in Sweden? That's the kind of thing got me thinking. Thank you.
Well, that's a really great question, and there's a paper on our website that released last month or 2 months ago, which addresses that question of how do you work with extrinsically orientated people. So just that maps onto a political kind of right of center. How do you get extrinsically orientated people to take intrinsically orientated actions? And there's whole research on that, which I would encourage you to read. But I think we have to be honest. I used to work for a communications agency where our approach was very much extrinsic. We would say, be sexy and buy this green product, or be cool and recycle, and it worked, but only in the short term. So this is again that example of if in the moment being green and being cool both fit within the same action, great. But the moment that they become separated, we've strengthened the thing that we're trying to oppose. So I think it's not that extrinsically orientated communications or campaigns don't work. That's not true. They do. They can work. But it depends on how long is the time view that we're taking and how deep do we want this commitment to go with the people that we're working with. So that's a really difficult question, and one which I can't really answer. But I definitely recommend, I'll send that to Pella as well, that paper, which maybe you can distribute, Pella.
I sure can. And now I want to talk to you and to everyone. So thank you very much, Casper. Our time is up, and we've gotten a lot from you that we can discuss further tonight when we have our fika. That's coffee.
Can I just say one thing?
You can.
Which is that in England, everyone always says, look at Sweden. So my question for you is, please keep on being amazing, because you are our example. So
yeah, Rich gave us that one too, and I think have you talked about that, because I don't think he will say that again. Sorry, we took him out of his illusions. Okay.
Thank you for having me. I hope this was useful.
It was very useful. We will give you a hand.